So we left off with this idea that Socrates has that death is something that should be welcomed by the philosopher. And he wants to explain, as far as I suppose, well, he wants to explain what he means, and as far as possible to argue that it is in fact true. But he says something on page 6 that I'd like you to take, I'd like you to note well, especially with regard to the sort of sequence of this class. We've just come off an extended exploration of death, sort of within that Epicurean space that's created by Epicurus's theory of death as death. Death is the privation of all consciousness. That is, if we look at what Epicurus actually wrote, I think the beginning of his argument about death is that death is the privation of all awareness, the absence of all consciousness, and that really is his definition of death, and everything flows from that. Socrates also, Plato also, Plato being the writer here, and Socrates being the man that Plato is depicting. But Plato wrote this. But so let's just say Plato's beginning point, his first principle, is here on page 6. He asks the character Simmias, "Do we believe there is such a thing as death?" "To be sure," replied Simmias. And Socrates says this, "Is it not the separation of soul and body? And to be dead is the completion of this. When the soul exists in herself and is released from the body, and the body is released from the soul, what is this but death?" "Just so," he replied. So, proceeding dialectically, that is, Socrates asks people what they believe, and if they can come to some agreement about things that they believe, they argue on the basis of that accepted hypothesis, let's say. And they see where it leads them. That's my understanding of what it means to proceed dialectically. You take your best guess and you see where it leads you, and if it leads you towards truth, that's great. If it doesn't, then you go back and you start over. But the real beginning of the treatment of death here is this assumption, and it is an assumption, that death is the separation of soul and body. And think about how different that is from what Epicurus has to say about death, the way that Epicurus characterizes death. Death is the separation of soul and body, and that sort of sets, I think it's important to note, just for reading this dialogue, because it sets the task that Plato has to complete. Because if you think about, okay, we can accept the idea that death is a separation of soul and body, whatever soul is. We'll just take it for granted that there is such thing as soul. And that, okay, the human being in some way or another consists of both these two different types of thing, a soul, which is apparently immaterial, and a body, which is definitely material. And that death is when these two things part. Clearly, I think we could all agree that the body dies. The body does die. The body decays when it separates from soul, but it has no future. That it disintegrates and goes back, back into dust. But the soul, he wants to argue, continues and has an independent existence. So we can accept the idea that death is the separation of soul and body, but then the natural question is, well, what reason do we have to believe that the soul continues in some sort of existence once it has separated from the body? I would say that that's the whole dialogue, at least philosophically speaking. That is, if not the whole dialogue, philosophically speaking, is the central question, and everything that follows from this point on should, in some way, if Plato's doing his job, support that idea that after this separation of soul and body, that soul goes on and has some sort of continued existence.